December 16, 1944. The fog over the Roer River hung thick as iron. In the pre-dawn silence, only the slow pulse of water echoed between broken tree lines and frost-bitten reeds. The ground was slick with mud, frozen boots, and the metallic scent of oil drifting across the current. German sentries, wrapped in gray wool, scanned the opposite bank through dim field glasses. The river, swollen by rain and the deliberate destruction of upstream dams, was supposed to hold the Americans back for days, perhaps weeks. But as the mist began to thin, shapes emerged. They weren't infantry boats or scattered rafts. They were steel giants, Shermans, crawling across the water on something that shouldn't have existed yet. Beneath them floated a chain of metal pontoons locked in perfect rhythm, rising and falling with the current like a breathing organism. The Germans stood motionless. Where there had been nothing but river hours earlier, a bridge now carried an army, and it had appeared overnight. The clank of steel plates and the steady roar of engines became the sound of disbelief itself. By late 1944, the Western Front had become a contest of endurance and ingenuity. After the brutal hedgerow fighting in Normandy and the bloodletting at Aachen, the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies pressed relentlessly toward Germany's interior. Yet a natural barrier now stood in their path, a series of rivers that cut across the landscape like living walls. The Roer, the Moselle, and finally the Rhine. The Germans understood their power. Bridges were blown, dams opened, and floodgates sabotaged to turn each crossing into a trap. The Wehrmacht's engineers believed that the swollen Roer would delay the Americans for weeks, perhaps giving the Reich time to regroup. Rivers had always been nature's ally in war, and the Germans took comfort in that. But the Americans came armed with something new, not a secret weapon, but a philosophy of movement. Since North Africa, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had perfected a doctrine built on adaptability. Where terrain stopped others, they built paths. Where rivers divided, they connected. The floating bridge, a chain of modular pontoons that could be assembled under fire, became their quiet signature. To German eyes, it looked primitive. Steel boats, wooden decking, men in grease-stained uniforms working with cranes and ropes. But beneath that apparent chaos was a choreography of logistics and precision. Each section of bridge, prefabricated miles away, was hauled by trucks to the front, unloaded in exact sequence, and locked into place in darkness. Within hours, the U.S. Army could lay a 400-foot floating roadway capable of carrying a 30-ton Sherman. And as the winter of 1944 tightened its grip, the engineers prepared for their most daring task yet: bridging the Roer under enemy fire. The floating bridge was born not from theory, but necessity. In North Africa, American engineers had learned that roads vanished with every sandstorm. In Sicily, they discovered that rivers, though shallow, could halt an armored advance for days. By the time the Allies stormed Normandy in June 1944, bridging had become both science and art, and the U.S. Army led that quiet revolution. At first, the Germans scoffed. Their engineers prided themselves on monumental construction: stone arches, fixed steel spans, and precision-built railway bridges. They built for permanence. The Americans built for movement. The German philosophy of engineering was rooted in control, the American one in improvisation. From the beaches of Normandy to the flooded plains of the Meuse, U.S. engineers deployed modular pontoon systems that could be assembled anywhere, even under fire. Bailey bridges, designed by the British but mass-produced in the United States, gave the Allies a tactical rhythm that the Axis never matched. While German divisions required weeks to repair or rebuild a destroyed crossing, American engineer battalions could raise a new one overnight. Official German records later described the Allied bridging teams as mechanized carpenters, a dismissive label that masked a growing unease. Each time a river was thought impassable, the Americans crossed it anyway. Each crossing shifted not just the front lines, but the psychology of the war itself. By November, as the weather worsened and the Siegfried Line crumbled, Hitler's staff issued a new directive: destroy every bridge, dam, and culvert that could slow the U.S. advance. But by then, the Americans had learned to carry their own rivers with them. And on the frozen banks of the Roer, hundreds of tons of pontoon sections and steel panels waited in convoy, silent, cold, and ready to redefine what was possible before dawn. The U.S. Army's bridging operations were not feats of luck, but the outcome of meticulous coordination, the kind that blurred the line between engineering and warfare. Each floating bridge began as an equation: river width, current speed, expected tonnage, artillery range, and available daylight. Then came the rhythm: trucks, cranes, cable lines, and men moving in silence. Engineer battalions like the 291st and 9th Armored worked under conditions few infantrymen could bear. Theirs was a war of rope burns, crushed fingers, and frozen water lines. Every plank laid was a calculation made in seconds. Every pontoon anchored while artillery thundered somewhere upstream. Floodlights were forbidden. Only moonlight and red-lensed lamps guided the process. The logistical machine behind these operations was staggering. Each 1,000-foot bridge required over 80 pontoons, 40 trucks, 100 tons of steel decking, and fuel for generators that powered the air compressors and winches. Yet, astonishingly, entire structures rose overnight, sometimes within 8 hours of reaching the riverbank. Artillery officers coordinated smoke screens while infantry provided covering fire. It was, in essence, a ballet performed amid chaos, the sound of hammering drowned by the crack of distant mortars. When daylight returned, tank crews often found a new road where none had existed before. Sherman commanders would roll forward, glance once at the floating steel beneath their treads, and drive on as if trusting the bridge more than the river itself. For the Americans, every successful crossing was not only a tactical victory, it was proof that ingenuity could replace brute strength. And for the Germans watching from the opposite bank, the realization was slowly setting in. No natural barrier could stop a nation that refused to stand still. To the men who built them, the bridges were not just structures. They were lifelines. Each section carried the weight of soldiers, the hum of engines, and the pulse of an army that refused to be stalled. For many American engineers, the work became personal. They called their bridges steel miracles, though they never used the word boastfully. It was a quiet pride, the kind that came from creating order out of destruction. Across the river, German engineers watched with a mix of disbelief and respect. Reports recovered after the war tell of officers who described the Americans as a people without hesitation. One lieutenant wrote that, "The enemy seems to build the very road he fights upon." For soldiers raised in a system where obedience and procedure ruled, the American brand of improvisation was both alien and unnerving. The symbolism was hard to miss. Every floating bridge carried more than tanks. It carried the American idea that movement itself was a form of freedom. In a war defined by fortresses and lines, the U.S. Army chose to remain fluid, dynamic, uncontained. Even small details echoed that philosophy. Engineers painted white stars on pontoon decks, not for decoration, but for recognition from the air. Those stars, gleaming under the winter sun, seemed to drift across the rivers like silent flags of defiance. For German units along the Roer, it was not just the material threat that unsettled them. It was the tempo. The Americans advanced with the confidence of men who believed obstacles existed only to be solved. That rhythm, fast, flexible, relentless, was the true weapon of the U.S. Army. And as December deepened, that rhythm was about to meet the cold reality of a river swollen by war. Night fell heavy over the Roer on December 16, 1944. The wind cut through the reeds, carrying the faint hiss of water striking steel. Along the western bank, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers moved like shadows, hunched, silent, faces blackened with soot to mask the reflection of lantern light. Orders were whispered, never spoken aloud. Somewhere behind them, the engines of Shermans idled softly, their warmth frosting into the air. At precisely 2300 hours, the first pontoon slid into the river. It rocked once, twice, then steadied. Chains clanked. The sound, barely audible, was immediately swallowed by the current. The men worked in pairs, one holding the ropes, the other locking the steel couplings. Within minutes, the first 20 meters of the bridge began to take shape. German artillery observers, half asleep in their hillside posts, had no idea what was unfolding below. The Americans had timed the operation perfectly. Between scheduled German artillery shifts and under a cloud-thick sky that masked both moonlight and reflection. Smoke shells fired earlier in the evening still lingered in the cold air, forming a ghostly curtain over the valley. Every movement was measured. One slip, one loud clang, and the illusion of silence would vanish. But discipline held. At intervals, the engineers checked current speed, depth, and tension lines. They worked with gloves soaked in ice water, their fingers stiff yet unyielding. By 0300 hours, the bridge stretched halfway across. The current pulled hard against the pontoons, testing every cable. A lieutenant, watching through binoculars, saw the faint shimmer of starlight reflect off the steel decks and muttered, "Keep it breathing." That phrase, passed quietly from team to team, became a rhythm of its own. When dawn began to gray the horizon, the final decking was bolted into place. A single horn blast echoed from the bank. The signal. The bridge was alive. Behind the engineers, a line of Sherman tanks stirred awake. Their engines thundered to life, rumbling like a storm held in reserve. The impossible was now real, a floating highway across the Roer, built in darkness under the enemy's nose. At first light, the fog began to lift, reluctantly, as if unwilling to reveal what had happened overnight. The Germans on the far bank rubbed frost from their binoculars, expecting to see only churned mud and the remnants of another failed crossing attempt. Instead, they saw movement, dark, heavy, deliberate. Sherman tanks. One by one, they appeared out of the haze, rumbling forward over something that should not have been there. A line of pontoons, hundreds of them, linked like vertebrae across the gray water, carrying the weight of 30 tons apiece. Each tank groaned as it rolled over the steel decking, the planks flexing but never giving way. For a few seconds, the German observers were silent. Then came the disbelief. The frantic calls over field telephones, the shouts for artillery corrections, the echoing demand, "Wie ist das möglich? How is this possible?" The first shells landed wide, sending plumes of muddy water into the air. The Americans barely slowed. Engineers crouched low along the bridge, repairing splintered planks as shells fell around them. Tank crews gripped the controls tighter, faces grim under the glow of engine light. Each Sherman that made it across became a statement, not of arrogance, but of inevitability. They were not just crossing a river. They were crossing the limits of what the enemy believed could be done. At 0630 hours, the bridge shook under the passage of the 5th tank column. The German artillery finally found its range, striking closer now. One pontoon broke free, spinning downstream. But within minutes, a new section was hauled into place. Rope, steel, and sheer determination filled the gap before the next tank arrived. By mid-morning, an entire armored battalion had crossed. Infantry followed, boots striking the steel in unison, rifles glinting in the pale sun. The Americans had transformed the Roer from a barrier into a road. On the eastern ridge, a captured German diary later recorded the moment. They built through the night, as if time itself obeyed them. The river, once a shield, had betrayed its defenders, and the echo of tank tracks across water became the sound of history turning. When the guns fell silent that evening, the Roer no longer looked like a river. It was a corridor of steel lined with the wreckage of spent shells and drifting debris, yet alive with motion. Trucks rolled across the floating roadway, hauling ammunition and rations to the far bank. Engineers, their uniforms soaked and faces smeared with oil, stood aside as tanks thundered past, exhausted but triumphant. From the German side, the disbelief turned to alarm. Field reports flooded into command posts along the Siegfried Line. Enemy armor has crossed in force. Bridge remains operational despite shelling. Pontoons appear indestructible. Intelligence officers scrambled to calculate how such a crossing was possible in one night. Many refused to believe it had been built under fire. Others claimed it must have been prefabricated in secret, unaware that it had been assembled in less than 6 hours by men with frozen hands and unbroken. Wild captured German correspondence from the following week revealed a rare tone of admiration amid defeat. One engineer officer wrote, "Their machines are extensions of their courage. They build what they need when they need it." The crossing at the Roer was more than a tactical success. It shattered the psychological comfort the Germans drew from their rivers. Nature's ancient defenses. Each failed attempt to stop the Americans reinforced a growing truth. The enemy's strength was not only in firepower, but in flexibility. For the first time, German staff reports began referring to U.S. engineers as a mobile front. It was a phrase of reluctant respect, acknowledging that the Americans had made innovation itself a weapon. The river that once promised safety had become a mirror, reflecting Germany's exhaustion and America's unstoppable momentum. The Roer River crossing was not an isolated feat. It was the prelude to something larger. Within days, the momentum it created rippled across the Western Front. The bridge held firm under a constant flow of armor and men, transforming a once-stalled advance into a rolling surge toward the Rhine. By February 1945, American forces had captured the far bank in full, clearing the way for Operation Lumberjack, the final push into Germany's industrial heartland. What began as an engineering gamble now dictated the rhythm of the campaign. The floating bridges multiplied, one after another, across rivers that the Wehrmacht had sworn could never be crossed. German commanders soon recognized the scale of their miscalculation. Rivers that had been carefully flooded to trap Allied divisions became highways instead. Every attempt to regroup behind natural barriers dissolved as the Americans simply built new roads over them. The enemy's defensive logic, its faith in terrain, in geography, was being erased in real time. The success at the Roer also redefined the U.S. Army's doctrine of warfare. The line between combat and construction vanished. Engineers were no longer behind the front. They were the front. Their bridges didn't just carry tanks, they carried the idea that ingenuity could conquer any landscape. For the Germans, it was a sobering realization. The war was no longer about who held the strongest position, but who could move fastest, adapt quickest, and turn obstacles into opportunities. By the time American troops reached the Rhine weeks later, the legend of the floating bridges had already spread through both armies. To the U.S. soldiers, they were symbols of progress. To the Germans, they were omens, signs that nothing, not even the rivers of their homeland, could stop what was coming next. In every war, there are sounds that linger long after the guns fall silent. For those who crossed the Roer, it was not the roar of artillery or the crack of rifles. It was the clatter of steel plates locking into place, the low hum of engines rolling over water, the sound of a nation building its own road to victory. That bridge, fragile yet unyielding, came to symbolize more than a single operation. It represented a philosophy that freedom itself is movement, and movement demands courage. The Americans did not wait for the river to lower or the enemy to yield. They built forward. Each hammer strike was an act of faith, each pontoon a promise that no obstacle, natural or man-made, could dictate the pace of a free people. To the German engineers who once mocked the idea, the bridge across the Roer was a revelation, proof that flexibility could be stronger than rigidity, that innovation could outlast tradition. The empire of fixed lines and concrete walls was being undone by men who carried democracy in their hands and steel in their trucks. And as the tanks rumbled across that floating highway, each one left behind a reflection trembling in the water, a mirror image of determination, of purpose, of an idea too vast to sink. When historians later traced the route to the Rhine, they often began with the great battles, Remagen, Cologne, the Ruhr, but those who were there knew the truth. The path to Germany's heart began on the river where men refused to stop building. The Roer Bridge was not just a structure. It was the physical expression of America's belief that progress is earned through labor, that freedom advances plank by plank, built in the dark by hands that never rest. And long after the war ended, the rivers of Europe still carried that echo, the sound of a people who, when told something could not be done, simply began.